Good morning. I'm Greg Bertelsen, CEO of the Climate Leadership Council. I want to welcome you all to the Ted Halstead Climate Conversation Series. For those who aren't familiar with the Council's work, we've developed a bipartisan climate solution called Carbon Dividends that centers on an economy-wide carbon fee. Our research has highlighted the advantages of carbon pricing, such as rapidly reducing emissions, unleashing innovation, and enhancing American competitiveness. Our topic today is how we accelerate the decarbonization of the U.S. economy while ensuring we have a modern and reliable U.S. power grid. There's growing focus among lawmakers at the state and federal levels on the resilience and reliability of the electric grid as we steadily decarbonize our economy. By some accounts, the push to electrify new sectors to mitigate climate risks will soon triple our reliance on the electric grid. And this will happen just as the grid is already under strain from increasingly frequent and prolonged weather events. As last year's blackout in Texas attests, when the grid fails, the human and economic costs can be devastating. It's clear we need to create a clean, reliable grid, but how do we do so quickly and affordably? In a new report out today, Neil Chatterjee and I argue that an economy-wide carbon price is the key. We're going to kick this event off by diving into the report's findings. Next, Senator John Hickenlooper of Colorado will join us for his view from the Senate. And finally, Neil will be joined by Curt Morgan, CEO of Vistra Corp, on his perspective on how to strengthen grid reliability as we decarbonize. With that, I'd like to welcome Neil Chatterjee, who will join me for a briefing on our new report. Neil is one of our nation's leading energy market experts. He served as a member of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission from 2017 to 2021, including 2 stints as chairman. Prior to his tenure at FERC, Neil served as an advisor to then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, working to pass major energy, highway, and agriculture legislation. Now Neil works with us at the Council as a senior policy advisor and helps us refine the details behind our comprehensive carbon pricing plan. Neil, thanks so much for joining us today. Let's start with a bit of a foundational question. First, why do we care about grid reliability, and why is reliability such an important focus point as we decarbonize the U.S. economy and as we decarbonize the U.S. grid?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for having me, and to the Climate Leadership Council, and thank you for working with me on this paper. During my time at FERC, I made clear that I believe my colleagues and I's foremost responsibility was our oversight of the reliability of the grid, to make sure that when Americans hit the switch, the lights come on. And I think it's actually something that we take for granted here in America, that we have this incredible system of reliability. But it takes a lot of work to maintain and ensure that reliability. And I think increasingly Americans are becoming more aware of potential threats to reliability, and that as the energy transition takes place, we cannot take our eyes off of the importance of reliability. As you mentioned, when the energy system fails, like it did in Texas in February of 2021, it can impose billions of dollars of costs on the economy and can endanger public health and safety. And the reality is, as the energy transition continues, as climate change makes extreme weather events more frequent and severe, the reliability of the grid will continually be tested, and lawmakers, policymakers, and regulators need to factor in how to maintain reliability in the face of the threats of climate change and the energy transition and the pace of the energy transition.
Yeah, it's something we talked a lot as we developed this paper, Neil, that there's these 3 converging forces that are happening simultaneously. So we all agree and are committed to a rapid decarbonization of the economy and the grid, but we're doing so at a time in which the stakes continually get higher and higher. Extreme weather events, a profound shift in our existing energy resources that is happening by many accounts more rapidly than we anticipated, while at the same time, we are likely to be leaning even more heavily on the grid as we continue to electrify the economy. And so in the paper, we laid out 5 main arguments for why we think carbon pricing is so aptly suited to rise to this challenge. And so I'll highlight the first argument we made, which is that carbon pricing values flexibly all emission reductions in real time. If we are going to decarbonize the US economy, most tend to agree that the early emission reductions, the early low-cost emission reductions, are likely to predominantly come from the power sector. And so if we're going to maximize what the electricity grid can provide us in terms of emission reductions, we essentially need to do three things. First, we need to bring on new clean energy resources, of course, and a carbon price is very well suited to providing that price signal to investors, to project developers, and give them certainty that their investments will continue to be rewarded for its low carbon attributes well into the future. The second thing we need to do is we need to maximize the emission reductions that are available on the grid as it exists today. We are leaving points on the board, so to speak, in the way we're currently operating the grid. And if we had a carbon price in place, grid operators would receive the signal in every hour of every day to increasingly select the resource mix that provides electricity with the lowest carbon emissions. And then finally, we need to lean more heavily on the demand side. We need to increase our investments in energy efficiency. And of course, a carbon price sends a very nice price signal to electricity consumers to continue to find ways to use electricity more efficiently. And what is really useful about a carbon price in achieving all three of those goals is it sits on top of the way the grid already operates. It sits on top of how grid operators already make their decisions. So it doesn't require grid operators to sacrifice their number one mission, which is to provide electricity reliably and at low cost. It simply sits on top and creates a nudge within each hour of each day towards lower carbon options. So Neil, with that, I'll kick it back to you. And if you want to talk a little bit about the neutrality benefits of carbon pricing.
Yeah, look, carbon pricing is technology and location neutral. And this is significant because a carbon price encourages companies to invest in diverse resources that can meet consumer demand while achieving the highest levels of emissions reductions. And it's really, it is the most efficient economic mechanism in which to drive down these, to drive emissions reductions while maintaining reliability. With a carbon price, with a transparent price on carbon, rather than mandating which electricity resources are built or where they are built, carbon pricing encourages companies to build new low emission generation where it can best serve customers and it can meet customers, where they are and where the demand is. And it's a superior mechanism when you're focusing on maintaining reliability. I mentioned earlier the grid incident in Texas, a very conservative state that's grid was pushed to the brink and reliability was challenged. We had a similar event last summer in California where due to extreme heat and wildfires, California's grid was pushed to the brink. In that instance, you had certain policy decisions. Certain resources were taken offline before their balancing resources were in place. And that ultimately led to rolling blackouts and brownouts and compromised reliability, was costly economically, and endangered health and public safety. With a transparent price on carbon, grid operators can focus on maintaining reliability while driving down emissions in a technology and locational neutral way, which really makes it in my view, the superior tool to transition to a lower carbon economy while maintaining reliability.
Thanks, Neil. The next argument we make in the paper is that a carbon price fits in really well with the existing energy system. And this again comes back to the concept that we're leaving opportunities on the table as the grid exists today. And so during hours of the day in which variable renewable resources can provide a large percentage of the power, that's very positive. It means that we're receiving very low cost, zero carbon electrons. But there, of course, are parts of the day in which we need to lean more heavily on emitting resources when solar resources are not available because it's nighttime or when the wind is not blowing. So inevitably, we need to, at some parts of the day, rely on fossil resources. The way the system currently operates, there's no signal to grid operators to choose the lowest cost emitting resources within that mix. And if you layer a carbon price on top of that, in every hour of every day, it will reshuffle the resource mix such that grid operators are providing not only the lowest cost available resources, but are factoring in the low carbon or zero carbon attributes of those power sources. So again, we're leaving these opportunities on the table by not pricing carbon. A price on carbon fits very well into the existing way grid operators operate the system, and does so in a way in which they're adding a new factor, which is emission reductions, in their decision making about which resources are dispatched to provide electricity demand.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. That's a fantastic point, and it leads into the next point on the slide, which is that carbon pricing supports long-term infrastructure investments and innovation because carbon pricing sends a steady, predictable economic signal. And this is really important because that steady, predictable signal provides investors, grid operators, and power system planners with better data to forecast supply and demand. And what I saw during my time at FERC, which is what really led me towards this policy, is that a patchwork of other constantly evolving policies lacks the long-term clarity and stability required to support durable investments, to drive innovation, and it impacts market structures. And so what we saw during my tenure at FERC was in trying to maintain reliability and affordability and market efficiency, this patchwork of policies was distorting market signals and was really leading to a number of market inefficiencies. And a transparent price on carbon, the most important thing it does is send that clear, steady, predictable economic signal, which is so important for investors and for having that data to accurately forecast supply and demand.
Thanks, Neil. And we can take that one step forward, which leads into the final point, which is that an economy-wide carbon price, of course, is economy-wide. And as we've already discussed today, it's likely that a big portion of the near-term emission reductions are likely to come from the power sector. But we also know that we can't get to zero carbon in the electric sector today. That is the long-term goal. And we also suspect that as we get closer to zero within the power sector, those final emission reductions become more challenging. And so another enormous advantage of a carbon price is that it stretches across the economy and relies on other sectors to find low-cost emission reductions. And because the fact that the goal is not simply to decarbonize the power grid, which is an important goal, it's to decarbonize the entire economy. In fact, it's to move the entire world towards a lower carbon future. And another advantage of a carbon price, which is sort of beyond the scope of the conversation today, is that a carbon price is very neatly paired with a border carbon adjustment, which is a lever to expand the emission reducing capability of a carbon price beyond our borders. It starts to bring in other countries to do their part. So again, we view this economy-wide feature as one that supports the decarbonization of the overall electric grid, but also, more importantly, perhaps supports the broader decarbonization of the U.S. economy and the global economy. Neil, we're getting close to the end of our portion of the meeting, but I'll turn it to you to have the final word and bring things home.
Yeah, look, this is an important conversation. I'm glad we're having it. I really think that this paper has touched upon, kind of a novel area. I don't believe this concept of tying a carbon price to reliability has been this thoroughly explored before, and I'm really eager to get people's feedback on it. The reality is this energy transition is underway. It's happening quickly, And I think that provides tremendous opportunity, but we have to be careful that we don't skip the transition part of the energy transition. What we really need is a durable solution that accelerates decarbonization while factoring in the need for a transition to maintain reliability and keep it front and center. We cannot take our eyes off of reliability during this transition. And I really believe, and the paper reflects, that a carbon price is the solution to do that, that it offers maximum flexibility and least cost emissions reductions as we move to a reliable, low carbon grid. And by mobilizing these emissions reductions from beyond the power sector as well, this is the policy to move us forward, to drive the energy transition, to not take our eye off of the importance of reliability and energy security. I really encourage people to read the paper, give us your feedback, but I really think now is the time to have this conversation as we are in the midst of this critical energy transition and we are looking for smart solutions to move forward. We've got to achieve this transition while maintaining reliability, and this flexible price on carbon is, in my view, is the superior tool to achieve that.
Thanks, Neil. Really delighted to partner with you on this, and I know we're going to hear more from you and Curt Morgan in a few moments. Just to reiterate, if you would like to read the full paper, it's on our website at clcouncil.org. And as Neil mentioned, we're eager to hear your feedback. In a moment, we are going to welcome Senator John Hickenlooper to the conversation, and I know we're just getting the tech set up as we go. But while we wait for the senator to join us, I'm going to just briefly introduce him. Most of our participants today are quite familiar with Senator John Hickenlooper, the senator from Colorado. He began his career as a geologist before successfully running a small business. In 2003, he was elected mayor of Denver. After serving 2 terms, he was elected governor of Colorado, serving from 2011 to 2019. In 2020, Senator Hickenlooper was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he currently serves on the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and the Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. And as we await the senator joining us, I'd just like to remind the audience that they can submit questions for Senator Hickenlooper below in the question and answer tab of the Zoom webinar, and we will field as many as we can during this segment. Very good, and it sounds like the senator's with us. Good morning, Senator. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Oh, doing quite well. Doing quite well. Really appreciate you taking some time during what we know is an extremely busy time in Washington, busy time for you. I actually wanted to start outside of Washington. We are, of course, having this discussion with the world in turmoil. We are all watching the tragic events unfold in the Ukraine. The president of Ukraine just briefed Congress. Today's event obviously is talking about climate policy, but I'm curious, you've thought a lot about energy policy, climate policy over your career. And in the current world that we're living in, how do you see our geopolitical priorities and our climate objectives interacting? Do you see them as complementary? Do you see them as conflict? I'm curious to get your take.
Well, this is one world, one planet. So climate change has to be, it has to be the existential threat that we all recognize and are willing to act on. That being said, we also live in a geopolitical world that has competing needs and aggression What we see in Ukraine now is obviously unspeakable, but unacceptable. And I think as we look at solutions to climate and the challenges of climate change, we should be keeping in mind that we have to create solutions that will satisfy geopolitical needs. So an example on this would be, as we move towards clean energy, how do we help Europe make that transition so they're not held hostage by Russia I think in a material way? That is something that works. They can have can be a two-pointed spear. In other words, you can do both at the same time. But that's the kind of solutions we need to look at, is how do we make sure that we're facilitating the world moving towards to greener energy, cleaner energy, as well as just in the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And we obviously agree with you. And there's a role in our view that domestic climate policy can play both in our climate objectives, but also in furthering a lot of our geopolitical objectives, which is why we've been so enthusiastic about a market-based approach backed by a price on carbon, a border carbon adjustment. But you really have been a champion for climate action. I mean, since the day you entered the Senate and prior to in earlier portions of your career. It's a challenging issue. And now you're operating in what I would argue is an even more challenging political arena. I'm curious, what keeps you motivated to continue pursuing climate solutions? And if you'll indulge me, what brought you to carbon pricing as one of the preferred options that you've been looking at?
So I was lucky enough to get a master's in earth and environmental science back in 1979. That's a long time ago. I take that, yeah, the very beginning of 1979. Back then, we called it the greenhouse effect. We didn't call it climate change, but we recognized it for the existential threat that it is, or that we felt that it could become. Many of the estimates from back then appear to have been too conservative. When I first became mayor of Denver in 2003, one of the first things I did was hired a young woman named Beth Conover to be my director of sustainability. And we began building roundtables and support groups and all the different industries, making sure we really tried to ramp up conservation of insulation, retrofitting all the city buildings, all the buildings of our parks and rec, all the way up and down the level. I've tried to do this every step of the way, but it really wasn't until there was an energy, a guy out of Stanford named Jay Precourt would put on an energy conference every year up in the mountains. And I was there, and George Shultz would come every year. George Shultz, one of the founders of CLC, obviously. I don't have to tell you that. But Jay Precourt would seat me right next to George Shultz. I think the first time was in 2014 or maybe 2015. And Shultz immediately went into this, all the work I'd done in sustainability, how much difference did I think I made? And did I have an overarching solution? I said, well, we've got to do this and this and this and that. He says, too many details. We need a solution where we can harness the power of the open market and really provide incentives that are going to get everybody recognizing that they can get a better price for their business, they can make more money from their wages if they are operating in a greener system. And how do you provide those incentives? And then he kind of laid out what a fee and dividend system could look like. Then I was the governor of Colorado, and I was resistant at first, but he's very persuasive. And so he got me pretty much there, and I started talking about it and reading up on it. And then the next year, they had the same energy conference, and Jay Precourt again sat me next to George Shultz, and he came up with a whole new array of arguments. Then I realized clearly that George Shultz was not a normal mortal like the rest of us, that he really did operate on a higher plane. The year after that was the year where, again, I was seated next to George Shultz, and he pushed even harder. And I remember he said very clearly that if he was going to be remembered for one thing, having done so much in his amazing career, he said that if he can be remembered as one of the people that really pushed hard for a fee and dividend, and in so doing, created a roadmap by which we actually get the whole country and ultimately the whole world focusing our efforts on moving into a greener future. He said that was how he'd like to be remembered. And that I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he is remembered for that.
Well, we are grateful for that. And I think I can safely say that no individual on the planet has brought more people to the carbon pricing, carbon dividends discussion than Secretary Shultz, present company included, very clearly. So something that I know you've given a lot of thought to is technological innovation as an essential part to unlocking climate solutions. Carbon capture and sequestration, something that you've given a lot of thought to. Curious how you see CCS fitting into the discussion, how you see technological innovation fitting into the solution discussion.
Well, I think what we're moving towards is to have a cohesive plan, a comprehensive and cohesive plan that allow us to begin to really put some granularity into what this solution is going to look like, what the transition is going to look like. And I certainly believe that we need a lot of technological innovations. We don't really know how to capture carbon efficiently yet, or sufficiently efficient. We also don't recognize, I mean, there's too much carbon in the air already, so we've got to figure out how to do that. But even going forward, are we going to be able to find a nuclear energy that's going to be safe enough and people will feel that is an acceptable part of the solution? People look at the battery developments and obviously wind, solar, but geothermal gets talked about more and more. The only way that I can see that you're really going to be able to create a roadmap by which these different pathways interact successfully is something like a fee and dividend. And within the fee and dividend, obviously you'd have to have border adjustments and really kind of drive what we do in this country. We need to find ways to drive that for the whole world. And if we just have a fee and dividend in this country, I think we're leaving a lot of chips on the table, and we're going to ultimately have a much slower process. But I think a lot of the world is ready to go to something like a fee and dividend if the United States would just lead. I think it's likely that Mexico and Canada and South America and Europe, obviously many of our allies, Japan, Australia, would jump on board because there again aren't really everything else is piecemeal. And by getting a price on carbon, you really create a constant incentive so that it's there's a financial reward for people dedicating a significant chunk of their time or their company's resources towards finding cleaner ways of doing everything. It's not just finding renewable wind and solar. It's also how do we get much less carbon emissions from concrete and from the manufacturing of steel and aluminum. You go down that list. By having a fee and dividend, you're creating a framework that does that. It provides those incentives for each and every category by which you can address the pollution of our atmosphere and the causes of climate change.
Yes, and to your point on the benefits of combining it with a border adjustment, I think we often forget just how powerful of a tool the U.S. economy is. And if we can create incentives at our border for importers to increasingly reduce their emissions, we can really maximize the benefits of a domestic U.S. policy. I want to turn to the audience for a question quickly. I know we only have about 5 minutes left, but this is a topic that's on a lot of folks' minds, Senator. Here we are. Inflation is a very real concern among the minds of many Americans. Rising costs, a very real concern. I'm curious how you respond to those concerns from your constituents around climate policy, carbon pricing, and rising costs.
Sure. And nobody likes inflation, right? Nobody likes broad, large scale inflation like we're seeing now. And this is, I'm old enough, so I was there in when we had the oil embargo in the 70s and saw that incredibly rampant inflation in the late 70s. I bought a little teeny house for $26,000 when I was just getting out of graduate school. And I paid 14% interest on my mortgage, and I thought I was lucky to get that. It's staggering to look back on that. But nobody likes inflation. But it really hits the working people, the people that are getting paid by the hour, that aren't on a salary with all the benefits. It hits working people the hardest. And what's great about a fee and dividend is it allows you to return to those working people. I think in most cases they would get maybe a little bit more than what they ended up paying in the increased costs, resulting from the fee. Their dividend would more than compensate them for that. And I think that's a crucial part of this argument. Is we don't want to put a burden on working people that they disproportionately, given that their budgets are so close to, in many cases, they're barely balancing their budgets at the end of every month. We don't want to put them and them shouldering not just the financial burden, but the emotional burden of that squeeze that they get at the end of the month. And I think that's a big part of, we've got to recognize and create that map. So as we transition to a clean economy, people are still driving in cars. We're not going to have electric vehicles, 100% electric vehicles next year or 5 years from now, and probably not for 10 or 15 years. People have different estimates on that, but the one thing you can feel pretty comfortable with is, if you want to protect the working people of America from undue pressure, having a fee and dividend can deliver that. So it will accelerate and in many ways amplify the transition. And I think this is happening. Even we haven't gotten to a fee and dividend yet, but the fee and dividend will really kind of push people more rapidly towards a greener future, but at the same time protect the most vulnerable people from undue consequences of that transition. And 100 years from now, we'll probably look back on 2022 and 2021 as the beginning of the great transition. I was struck in Glasgow, Scotland, that we had over 100 countries made a commitment to dramatically diminish or eliminate methane, fugitive emissions, but methane emissions completely or dramatically, significantly reduce those emissions. Holy smokes, when we first did, Colorado was the first state in the country to create a regulatory framework to eliminate or dramatically diminish methane emissions. And everyone, it was copied by Canada, taken up by the Obama administration, then the Trump administration rolled it back. But that kind of, in 5 years, to go from that to 100 countries saying that they're going to do everything they can to eliminate carbon emissions, that's real progress. And that, to me, is really defining that this transition is happening faster than maybe what we notice today. And assuming we can figure out some way to get a fee and dividend with border adjustments, get that done, we'll look back 100 years from now as, holy smoke, that was the beginning of an amazing change in our country and in the world. And if you imagine a world, I met and I'll shut up here in a second. I met the head of government relations for Polaris, which makes a lot of the snowmobiles and all-terrain vehicles that people use in the backcountry, and they're usually pretty loud. Well, they're now working on a full array of electric vehicles, and it allows you to, in those quiet places, imagine, what if we didn't have that roar that annoys? It's hard on the person driving, but it's also hard on the people they encounter along the way. This will be a different world if we all of a sudden we don't have that loud roar, we don't have those emissions and the pollution that comes with it, and even though we don't perhaps all see that this great transition has begun, I think it really has. And I think that as we increasingly expand and accelerate our efforts towards a cleaner economy, more and more people will see that we are in a transition, and that'll make them feel, I think, in some ways, more secure and more confident in the future.
Really appreciate that and completely agree. Once products and services are cleaner, better, and cheaper, it becomes very obvious how the transition takes place, and the carbon price is just an accelerator towards those ends. Senator, you've been so generous with your time. We're almost out of it. I want to ask you two questions. I can't let you go without asking for a prediction on what happens the rest of the year in terms of climate policy. And regardless, I'm just curious, what gives you optimism that we ultimately will bring the necessary stakeholders together, similar to what you were able to achieve in Colorado around methane, to address climate change in a meaningful way? Because at the end of the day, that's how we're going to have to solve this.
Yeah, so first, I think that there is still a strong will in the Senate to pass some of what was in Build Back Better. Pass a lot of that was around climate. And I think that there's still the will in the Senate. And I think that Joe Manchin, who's obviously the deciding vote, he on a number of occasions has expressed that the climate components are what he cares most about and would respond to. So I think there'll be something called by a different name, and it'll be slimmed down, and there'll be pay-fors so that it's not going to add to the debt. These are all things that he's supported loudly. But I think it'll be significant. I think that, putting more money into strengthening the grid, providing incentives for everything from electric vehicles to transitions in all manner of consumer items, those efforts, I think, will find their way into another bill. I just hope that we can keep the will alive to, look at something broader based like a price on carbon, just because when I talk to individual Republicans, now as a party, they're pretty much still locked down against anything to do with a fee and dividend. But when you talk to them individually, a lot of them are hearing from the small businesses and the people, the constituents in their home states, that climate change is real. They see these wildfires all over the country. They see the floods, the hurricanes, the mudslides, and they want us to get out ahead of it, which is a perfectly reasonable request from a constituent. And whether you're talking about states in the South or in the Midwest, some of these really red states are surprisingly aware and receptive to something like a price on carbon. Again, it would have to have border adjustments. That's one of the first things that pretty much Republicans and Democrats emphasize. But that is something that I think that it's going to happen. The change will happen so quickly we won't even see it coming. But suddenly there's going to be 15 or 20 Republicans saying, no, we've got to do this. We've got to take this more seriously, but let's use a free market solution that is more likely to unite both Democrats and Republicans.
Well, Senator, we are lucky to have such a thoughtful and committed leader in the Senate. We appreciate all your work around climate and other issues, and we really appreciate your time with us today. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, you bet, Greg. My pleasure, my honor. Thanks so much. And thanks for all the work you guys are doing.
With that, we will now turn to the next portion of our meeting, and I'm going to turn things back over to Neil, who will introduce our next speaker. Neil, over to you.
That was fantastic, Greg. A wonderful interview with Senator Hickenlooper. And I am pleased now to similarly welcome an esteemed guest, Curt Morgan. Curt has spent 37 years in the energy industry, a career that has spanned really the entire spectrum of the energy landscape. Curt has held leadership positions at NRG Energy, Mirant Corporation, Reliant Energy, and BP Amoco. He has also served as the president and CEO of both Equipower Resources Corporation and First Light Power Resources Incorporated. In 2015, Curt joined Energy Capital Partners, a private equity firm focused on investing in energy infrastructure. And in 2016, he became the CEO of Vistra Corp, a leading integrated retail electricity and power generation company. Today, Curt is joining us for a discussion on grid reliability as a key component to climate solutions. Just as with Senator Hickenlooper, the audience will have the opportunity to submit questions for Curt, and I will ask at the end of our discussion. As a reminder, you can submit questions below in the Q&A tab of the Zoom webinar. And with that, Curt, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Neil, how are you? Good to see you.
So as we discussed in the opening, extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and duration, placing unprecedented strains on the U.S. electric power grid. And when the grid fails, the human and economic toll can be staggering. You lived through some of this in Texas last winter. Can you just speak from your perspective about the importance of reliability and what you see as the potential threats to reliability as we undergo the energy transition?
Yeah, Neil, so in our business, we must balance three important objectives. Affordability of our essential product, and electricity is absolutely essential and is going to grow in its importance as we electrify the economy. Reliability, so that we can deliver that resource to who needs it, and the environmental footprint of our operations. And I'd say that that's with an emphasis on greenhouse gas emissions. And we have seen examples of where those three primary objectives have gotten out of balance, and we've got to balance them. And namely, what's happened in two instances, reliability has taken a back seat, and we can never allow that to happen in the electricity business. Texas affordability became oversized relative to reliability. Now, it was an honorable quest to make sure that businesses had the most affordable energy so that Texas could attract those businesses. But at the same time, we need to make sure that that balance stays in place. And of course, we saw what happened because a number of dispatchable generation assets retired. And then we had a dislocation in the integrated natural gas and power systems during Winter Storm Uri. And we had a tragic loss of power and then loss of life. Because when you lose electricity, especially during the winter, it's going to have some pretty deep consequences. And then in California, where there's been an honorable pursuit to try to get off of fossil fuels in the electric system, once again, we overshot reliability on this one. And this time it was around emissions. And again, we had premature retirement of generation that resulted in a disruption in supply-demand balance. So the one thing I think I would emphasize is that it is incredibly important that as we transition, and we are transitioning, and by the way, Vistra is a believer in climate change. We've been making changes. I inherited a company that was 70% coal. It's down to 20%, going down below 10%. And we are going through this transformation. But we cannot lose sight of reliability. And right now, the mix of intermittent resources, along with battery storage, with really only 4 hours of discharge, is not sufficient to be able to run the grid. So we still need some level of dispatchable resources, and will for quite some time. And I think we need to have a good plan going forward. We need to be deliberate about it, and to ensure that our product gets to our customer, because it is incredibly important.
Thank you for that. In our paper, Greg and I really point to NERC, which is the entity that is charged with safeguarding grid reliability in America. And, NERC points out that the hard truth is that rapid decarbonization does pose a challenge to grid reliability, and that while we can move to a 100% carbon-free power sector, we just aren't ready to get there today. Can you talk a little bit about how you have navigated that during your tenure, and how you think a price on carbon can play into that transition, as we are cognizant of what NERC says are the reliability challenges being posed by rapid decarbonization, and why perhaps a price on carbon is that reliability tool?
Well, the first thing in our fleet, and I believe this is true of the country in general, is that we have a mix of resources. Our company has wind, solar, battery storage, natural gas. As I mentioned earlier, we have some coal as well, nuclear. So you could call us sort of the all of the above. And I think that is still important. I think you got to have something that you can dispatch when it's called on, when intermittent resources are not available. So, I think that's the first thing that I would say that's really important, Neil, is to have a good mix. Now, when you speak of a carbon price, first of all, I was struck by Senator Hickenlooper's comments about, here's a Democrat senator talking to someone who served 3 Republican administrations and is a Republican. And the one thing I like about the Climate Leadership Council is that it brings many people who would never come together, organizations, economists, and others, over a common goal. And it was interesting to hear, how Senator Hickenlooper was influenced by George Shultz. And that's the way our company was. We were influenced by the commonality of a diverse set of members of the CLC. And I hope that the country can come together, because when you talk about a carbon price, I think the most effective way to do that is to do that on a nationwide basis. Unfortunately, if you don't do it on a nationwide basis, all it does is pushes the problem into somebody else's backyard. And so if you put a price in one region of the country, then generators in another region who don't have that price will actually get more runtime, and you'll see an actual and potentially an even increase in the amount of fossil fuels used, and you might actually see an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So the one, I think, critical thing on a carbon price is that it should be nationwide, which is going to require our federal government to take this action. And I'm glad to hear a senator like Senator Hickenlooper take leadership and ownership of that, and I hope that happens. The other thing I think is incredibly important that you mentioned earlier and it's in your paper is that capital formation is incredibly important in competitive electric markets. You have to be able to raise capital, and a carbon price is transparent. It's also across the economy. And so if you have uncertainty and a lack of clarity and lack of timing in competitive markets, it's a recipe for disaster, because you can't raise capital. The one thing that a carbon price allows us to do is to raise the capital because of the transparency and the certainty that it offers to markets. And it also creates an even playing field, which is also incredibly important in capital markets, is that they want to know that all the competitors have an even playing field. So carbon pricing to me is really the linchpin, not just in the electric sector, but across the economy. There's also been a tremendous amount of modeling that's been done that shows that mandates and subsidies just do not get, because they are also local or statewide, they do not get the kind of reductions in carbon that you would get from a nationwide price on carbon. And then the last thing, which is a big deal for me, is you got to make sure that the companies in the United States are still competitive. So this border carbon adjustment is an absolute must. And this will increase prices, by the way. A carbon price will increase prices, which is why the dividend concept is so important to have in this. And that's why we are a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council, and why we believe that the formula that they've come up with, which is simple, but could be very effective.
I appreciate so much of what you just laid out. First and foremost, I'm a Republican from Kentucky who was energy policy advisor to Mitch McConnell and served as chairman of FERC during the Trump administration. I arrived at this concept as the right policy solution, not in a vacuum, but because of what I saw taking place in markets and seeing that the current paradigm in many ways was untenable, not just in terms of reliability, but affordability as well, and in terms of capital formation and sending that clear signal. But I do want to touch on the last point you made regarding cost. There is, we all recognize there's a finite amount of taxpayer and investment dollars that can be used to usher in the grid of the future, and that consumers' tolerance for surging utility bills has a limit, particularly in an environment like we're seeing today with inflationary pressure. Can you talk a little bit about, and you touched on it with the dividend concept, but again, as opposed to other alternatives, a price on carbon is transparent so consumers can see what they're getting, whereas maybe with alternative carbon reduction mechanisms, there may be more hidden costs. Is that an accurate way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that is the way to look at it. And the other thing that a carbon price does is it breeds efficiency. So if I'm a coal generator or a natural gas generator, and there's a price on carbon, I want to produce as little carbon as I possibly can in order to compete. And that efficiency also translates into the cost of my generating asset, which then also affects price. And so anything that can be done on a market basis, where it provides a clear price signal and it also incentivizes efficiency, is good for consumers. And one of the things I worry about with other forms of, and by the way, these are all with good thoughts in mind. Everybody's trying to get to the same place to try to reduce carbon. But some of the other forms are less direct. They don't get the kind of decarbonization that you're looking for, and they also do not incentivize efficiency. And that is an issue for me, and I think it should be for policymakers, because I think you want to have markets that actually incentivize efficiency, and that's like a carbon price does that, and it does that on an economy-wide basis.
I've got a question from the audience here in the box. What, in your view, are the most promising technical innovations on the horizon in your industry that will help us decarbonize the grid while maintaining reliability?
Yeah, so there's a number of them, and a lot of promising things. And I guarantee you, there's some things that I'm not thinking of, but that are going to come and probably surprise all of us. But first of all, I think there's going to be a continued advancements in wind and solar. I don't think we're done on that, and I think the cost curve is going to continue to come down, which is good for all of us. But then I would say after that, there's a lot of capital. I always say follow the money, and when you see a lot of capital going into something, then I think you're going to see it come to scale, and you're going to see the cost curve come down. And hydrogen is an area where I see a lot of interest from a lot of smart money. And I ultimately believe that we're going to see hydrogen play a role, across the board in the economy. Carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. Our ability to capture in some form or fashion CO2 and then store it has been hampered. It's not like sulfur dioxide or nitrous oxide and others that we can do through a chemical process. So we have to actually capture it, separate it, and then we're going to have to store it. I think that's promising. And I do believe that if you get enough scale, that you're going to see, again, prices come down, which it needs to. Right now, the fact is carbon capture and sequestration needs to be subsidized. So I think those are really, the top things. But there are a number of different new technologies out there that are going to make a difference. We've seen this exponential change in our business, not in economy-wide, but also in the electric business, where it changes. The other one I'd say is small modular reactors, nuclear reactors. I think are promising, still very expensive relative to competitive markets and the ability to bring them in. But I do think they have a place and will have a place longer term. So there's a number of different technologies that, I think will play a role in reducing the carbon footprint of our business.
We're getting close to running out of time, so I have one final question, and Greg alluded to this earlier. We're having this conversation about climate and energy policy today, but it's impossible not to be constantly thinking of the people in Ukraine and what they're facing. And you mentioned the border carbon adjustment as a tool, and I think we're seeing Americans respond to the devastating crisis in Ukraine in a way that we're willing to make changes to weaken our enemies and not be dependent on petrostates like Russia. In your view, would something like a border carbon adjustment punish a Russia, punish a Venezuela, punish an Iran? And could America really take advantage of our carbon advantage and then couple that with a domestic price? It seems to be the appropriate time to have that conversation while we're seeing what's taking place in Europe.
Well, first of all, I don't know if I'd call it a punishment, but I will say this, that one of the big concerns I hear on, Capitol Hill, on both sides of the aisle is that we cannot do something like this and jeopardize the competitiveness of U.S. industry. And so I think there's just a fairness aspect. The other argument that is made is that the U.S. has done more than any other country, and it is slated to do more in many of the agreements, and they view that as a bit unfair. They look at it and say, how come China is adding coal plants and we're shutting them down? And they look at that competitiveness, and I think that's fair. But I think this carbon border adjustment, what's important about that is it will force other countries to come to the table and on a level playing field, and it would also make sure that we uphold the competitiveness of U.S. industry. The other thing is it's a revenue generator, and so if you think about Russia importing hydrocarbons or other Venezuela and other bad actors, we're actually taking revenues from those countries, and we can use those as we see fit, and we could even use those to help support Ukraine or any other country that is viciously, attacked for no good reason at all. So I do think it plays a role. I think it can play a role in helping provide revenues to accelerate the transition to a clean economy. But I think in certain times, it could also be a source of revenues to help countries like a Ukraine that need that assistance. But in order to do this and be fair, we've got to make sure that the U.S. companies are not disadvantaged. And we also need to see more effort from other countries to reduce their carbon footprint. And this will force many of those, and I like to think of it as incentivize them to come to the table and do that.
Well, thank you, Curt, for joining us today. This has really been a great and timely discussion. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, Senator Hickenlooper and Greg, for your participation today. And I really want to thank everyone who logged on. I know we're all getting accustomed to virtual presentations, but I really hope that the next Climate Conversation Series event, that we'll all be able to come together in person to discuss solutions to address the climate challenge. Once again, I really want to invite folks to visit clcouncil.org to view the full report from today's event. I really think you will find it illuminating and look forward to having further discussions about it. Thank you again for joining, and have a wonderful remainder of your day.